Well, that was hard. Maybe because you didn't know what was happening. You lost control of 60 seconds of your life. Maybe it's hard because you have so much on your mind that just being still and silent is too much for you. Being silent truly is deafening. Of course, silence isn't literally deafening, but the absence of any sound can be so profound that it feels as though we might have gone deaf. The brain struggles to listen or even for the smallest sound. And if you're like some people, in the middle of silence, you'll begin to make some noise just so you can hear something. It literally becomes a strain on our ears. So when we say silence is deafening, we're declaring a paradox of thoughts. Obviously, silence cannot physically make a sound, but it shows us the absence of sound is so obvious, it becomes overwhelming, just as much as a loud noise can be. But we're used to loud noises. TV, radio, car noise, neighbors, coworkers, teachers, fellow students, kids, parents, our pets. Even the hum of a fan or a dishwasher is making noise. You ever have the electricity go out in the middle of the night and you wake up because it went silent? And even in your silence, when you're asleep, you recognize it and your body wakes up. Noise is what most of us live with and desire. I know many can't even go to sleep if it's silent. We are inundated with noise of the world around us, with distractions of the world, politics, cost of living, cultural and social warfare. To add to that, to add to our busy lives, life is loud and life is busy, full of busy noise. Summer's over, fall is in full swing. We're heading rapidly towards winter. Thanksgiving's just around the corner in a couple weeks, then Christmas, then New Year's. Don't forget about Columbus Day or even March the 7th, my birthday. It just keeps hitting us, and life just keeps rapidly rushing towards us. We feel busier this time of the year, and life begins to either get faster, or sometimes it feels like it just slows down to a crawl. Clutter begins to surround us, and our calendar is full of to-dos. It gets overwhelming sometimes, and then we try to get up and do the next day all over again. And we get up and do the next day all over again, and we keep doing that over and over again until we just can't. So what's the answer? Well, add something to your schedule, right? That's the answer. Find some time with our busy schedule to add more time to your schedule to be silent before God. That may seem crazy, right? But oddly, that is the exact right answer. Silence before God is golden. And not just that, it's required and needed for us just to survive in this world, just like eating, breathing, sleeping. In fact, Jesus himself would often sit silent. Jesus treated silence as a very important activity. We see Jesus sitting silent almost every time he finished one act of ministry and before he went to another one. He left for one, would sit silent, get alone, and go for another one. Luke 4:42, when it was day, he departed and went into a remote place. He did a miracle or two, taught some good truth, and then we see it again, Luke 5:15. Yet even more so, his fame was everywhere. Great crowds came together to hear, to be healed of him. He was overwhelmed with the noise of life, but he withdrew to the wilderness and prayed. A little later, after he did another miracle or two and taught some good truth, right before he chose his 12 apostles, Luke 6:12 says, in these days, he went out to a mountain to pray and continued all night in prayer to God. When he was day, he called his disciples, and of them he chose 12, whom he named apostles. I think it's interesting. It has nothing to do with the message today, but he called the disciples, and out of them he chose 12, which meant he had more than 12 disciples. Just think about that one for a little bit. All right. We see Jesus do this over and over and over again. Go off alone, find some solitude so he can be silent before God. Matthew 14:23, when he sent the crowds away, he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. And when the evening came, he was there alone. And not only did he show being silent before God in his life, he also taught it. But you, when you pray in your closet, and when you have shut the door, pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly. But when you pray, do not use vain repetitions as the heathen do, for they think they will be heard for their much speaking. Sometimes prayer is enough just to be quiet and silent. So if finding time to be silent is so important to Jesus, then silence needs to be just as important to us. If the one who is God in the flesh needs to be alone to find some quiet place and spend some time in silence, then it would make sense that we would need that even more. So what is silence before God? What does it look like? Silence is a practice of being intentional and choosing a time to not speak, but listen. Taking time not to listen to other noise around us, but being intentional about being silent before God. It's not something that you could do every day, obviously, but take the time to schedule a specific time to be silent before God in your life. Once a week, once a month. If you don't ever do it, start off with once a month. Try 60 seconds like we did a while ago and just realize how deafening that silence is. Don't be silent just to be silent, but be silent as you can listen and hear God's leading. As we might say, we hear his voice. I'm not talking about a literal voice like God is talking to you, but a prompting of the Holy Spirit, that quiet leading, that's his voice speaking to us. If we're silent, we will know and hear it in our hearts. Being silent also means to be intentional about finding time to be alone about other things, other people. Some of y'all are too excited about getting away from other people. Some of y'all are social, anti-social butterflies. You're like, oh, I get to be alone? I'm there. Some of y'all love COVID when they're like, y'all going to stay at home all by yourself? Yes. Some of y'all liked it so much you haven't come out of it. You're still there. But being silent isn't just to be alone so that way you can be all by yourself to watch the TV show you want to watch. No, being silent before God means you are silent, everything else around you. But I find trying to be silent with someone in the same room or the same house never works. Right? Tell your spouse, hey, go in the other room and watch TV. I'm going to sit here and be silent before God. Nope. Man, 5 minutes are coming out like, hey, did you take the trash out? Oh, hey, did you do this? Hey, can I ask you a question? My wife and I talk about that all the time when I'm just trying to study. I'm like, hey, I'm going to study in here. Or she'll do the same thing. Hey, I'm going to study my lesson. Okay. And like we're scrolling on Facebook. Hey, do you see this funny meme? Like I was trying to be quiet. So we got to schedule it. Be intentional. Take some time to be silent before God. The goal is to listen, to hear his leading. Now, some would say, well, I go out in nature and to sit out in the outside and listen. You know how much noise is outside? Like even if you go out into, go to the fishing camp or go to the hunting cabin or whatever, there's still noise all around you. I used to go, when I lived in Utah, there was a little creek that had a log that fell down that was my chair to sit on. And no one was ever there. I was always by myself, and I'd go sit on that log. But you know how much noise is around you? Like I'm sitting there trying to be quiet, and a little squirrel would come up behind me. I'd turn around. And so even being out in nature, you say, oh, I'm being silent with God, being out in nature. You could find distractions. So being silent is hard to really find silence, and you have to be intentional about it. The goal is to listen, to hear his leading. There's a great story in the Bible about someone being intentional about being silent before God. It's the story of Elijah. Elijah finds out that Jezebel is looking for him to kill him. He just had left one of the big contests, if you know the story, the one who decides who's God, right? The God of the universe or Baal, right? And of course, God won, right? All the priests of Baal that survived the contest, some of them didn't survive, but some survived the contest. Elisha had them killed, right? thinking that everyone now would be surely turned to God. Like now that God has shown how big he is and how wonderful he is, and all the prophets of Baal are dead, Elijah's like, yes, I just won this great victory, and he's up on a high, and he's doing great. And then Jezebel comes after him, and he flees in the desert and asks God to kill him twice. Talk about a roller coaster of emotions in one day. God just came down and showed himself to you, and not an hour later, you're in the desert going, God, I'm all alone. Elijah was depressed, and God sent an angel to feed him. The angel told him, go and stand in the mountain before the Lord. And then this is what happened. The Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind split the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake came, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire came, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood in the entrance of the cave. And a voice came to him and said, why are you here, Elijah? And he said, I have been very zealous for the Lord, Lord of hosts, because the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. He knew who he was speaking to. He was speaking to God, because he kept saying your, right? And I alone am left, and they seek to take my life. And the Lord said to him, go, return on the road through the wilderness of Damascus, and when you arrive, anoint Hazael to be king over Aram. God could not be heard in the mighty wind. God could not be heard in the earthquake. God could not be heard in the fire. But then a still small voice is heard when everything was silent, and it was like God was yelling at Elisha. He stood up, put his cloak over his head, went out in the cave and said, I hear you. And the voice looks at him and says, what are you doing here? What are you doing? Elijah could not stop thinking about himself. He was self-focused. Look at all the people against me. I'm all alone. It took Elijah to get distracted away from himself, see the fire, see the earthquake, see the wind, get distracted off of himself. And then once all that went away, he could hear the voice. God spoke in a small, quiet voice. Rarely does God ever shout. He wants us wanting to hear him. He wants us being intentional about listening. There are some good benefits of being silent before God. David tells us to not forget all his benefits. The main benefit, as we see in the story of Elijah, is to know God's leading, to hear him clearly, to hear him above all the noise of the world. Let me tell you something very important. Being silent before God is hard. Not just the action of being silent, but the emotional aspect of being silent. You could go get yourself physically alone and quiet before God, but then the emotional aspect comes in. Because silence makes us uncomfortable. How many felt uncomfortable at the beginning when there was just silence for 60 seconds? I heard you fidgeting and looking around, and people were looking at each other and whispering and trying to figure out what was going on, because it makes you uncomfortable. And then when we think about the discomfort, we stay silent even more until the uncomfortableness turns into a silence filled with God himself. Silence is often uncomfortable because we're focused on performing for others, trying to meet others' expectations, and silence confronts that. As we take the time to be silent before God, we start to see who we really are, and we become aware of our motivation of why we do the things we do. And we don't like that. We begin to be silent before God, and we start realizing and seeing the things that we do and the focus that we have and the motivation behind things, and we get confronted with that, and we begin to be worried and concerned that we're not doing things the right way and we don't have the right focus, and then we don't like that, so then we stop being silent. See, silence just isn't noise, but it's also no activity. And to no activity, I'm not talking about physically just sitting there quiet. I'm talking about sitting still for a period of time to do, no activity to be better. Well, I want to be silent before God so I become a better Christian. Just that action is the wrong focus. So if we're silent before God so I can be a better Christian, you're doing it to be better. You're doing an activity. Your silence becomes your action. And that's not what we're talking about. Sometimes we just need to stop doing to be the best Christian we can be, and be silent before Him in our actions and watch Him lead and go and do through us. Often, being silent, praying, meditating on His Word can become a doing thing to be better at being good. And that's not the desired intention. It's not the goal. I read my Bible, I prayed, I was silent. Check, 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 next. And that's not what we're talking about. One of the driving motivations of society today, and honestly most religion today, is do more, get better, be better, go higher, do it faster, go further. People are constantly under pressure to perform better, to do more. These motivations guide every part of their lives. And when we think that they're not, we find out in the silence that they were. But when we're truly being silent before God, all the doing, all the pressure to be better should fall away. And we begin to see and understand how God sees us. Silence before God helps us understand that there is a difference between our actions and who God says we are. Often, our actions are way different than who we are. And when we're silent, we begin to see who we are, and it begins to put a spotlight on our actions. In the silence from before God, it becomes unnecessary to perform. We don't need to explain. We don't need to compare. We don't need to justify. We don't need to pretend. There, in the silence before God, I am free to be who God says I am. It gives us time to reflect on the full meaning of why we exist. And maybe that is the part of the uncomfortableness. And we feel God leading us to make adjustments in our lives that we're not ready to make. And so we reject the silence because we don't want to change our motivations. So being intentional, scheduling a time to get alone, silence on audible noises around you, TV, radio, Spotify, whatever you got. Turn your phone off. Find a place without noise. By the way, Rayo's is not a good place to be silent at. Silent all the non-audible voices, the distractions, children, pets, right? Things like that. I can be silent in the house by myself, turn the TV off, turn my phone off, silence before me, and my dog will come and sit before me and stare at me because she wants to play or she brings a ball, right? So I've got to get away from even her to truly be silent. And that's hard to do. And then this, maybe the hardest part, is now silent your thoughts. Wow. All your cares, all your worries, all your emotions need to be set aside. See, that's what was happening with Elisha. Woe is me, I'm all alone, I just want to die. But it wasn't until the wind and the earthquake and the fire came that he got his mind off of himself and started looking at nature around him and heard all those things and like, oh no, and he stopped thinking about himself for just a little bit, and that's when the still small voice came. I'm not saying go find a fire or a big wind or an earthquake, but the idea is to set aside our thoughts of the problems we're having. So a lot of times just praying first, letting it all out, giving over to God, and say, okay, now that yours, God, I don't have to think about it anymore. And now comes the silence. Because God now wants to speak to us. Just sitting silent. Don't let your mind wander to the dark places. The Bible says to take every thought captive. This is part of the intentional, purposeful doing. You have to get yourself in that place to be able to hear the small voice of God. The Bible says that God yearns to be with our spirit, and that when we draw near to Him, He draws near to us. When the noise is gone and we're intentional about being silent and we draw near to him in our silence, we can hear him clearly. Silence does not mean that we are alone because God is in the silence. Silence does not mean that we're lonely and confused, because loneliness and confusion is not where God's at. It's when we're ignoring God. It's when the loneliness and confusion comes in. So silence without listening to God is where the struggle comes. When we know that God is present and we listen for him in the silence, it's when our loneliness goes away. It's when our confusion and our worries and our frets go away. We begin to feel the silence being filled with God's presence. We find a time of hope, a time of joy, as the silence begins to be filled by God. So we need to be alone to find the silence. There's a difference between loneliness and being alone. Jesus wants to lead us away from loneliness towards the silence, because it is there he's waiting for us. It is there that he wants to reveal himself to us. This is what Paul meant in the letter to the church of Philippi: to know him and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings, being conformed to his death. To know God, the power of his resurrection, to truly know that and know that he's right there in your presence. And this leads to another benefit of being silent before him. Our worship becomes more intimate. Not the loud singing, praising worship, but the silent worship of just being in his presence, feeling his leading, hearing his still small voice, and knowing that he is there. That awe feeling, that goosebump feeling, that being on our knees and their tears just falling feeling of God's presence, because it becomes so overwhelming, it fills the silence. In Habakkuk, we see God living in his holy dwelling place, and he commands us to be present with him there and to be silent in our worship. All the earth be silent, a holy silence in awe of a living God. And it's not just silence for silence sake, it is a silence before him of intimate worship before a holy God. Be silent before him. It is his day, every day, and he is present all around us. He has prepared the sacrifice of Christ for our healing, for our salvation. He has made us clean and his guests, as his guests through Christ. We are in his presence because of Jesus Christ. Because of this, he deserves our silent worship. He deserves our stillness before him. He yearns to speak to our spirit. He desires to lead you in your life, but we must be quiet to be silent before him. We need to be silent to the point where all our needs are met by God alone. It is like when a child can relax and be content with any worry or plans, just resting quietly in the arms of their parent. When we become so silent that our hearts are quiet, God will be able to speak to us, reveal himself to us, and lead us in our journey. Often God remains silent because there's too much noise in our life. Too many other noises that are listening to that we can't hear him, and so he will not speak. When more than one person speaks, it becomes challenging to hear the one who's talking to you, the one you want to hear, to hear. So I'm going to do something real quick, and I need some help with that. If I could have, let's see, Patrick, Josh, Kayla, let's have Jerry. Y'all come up here real quick. All right, Patrick, I want to stand right there and face that direction. Okay. Josh, I want you to go over there by that window over there and stand by the wall. Kayla, I want you to go at the back of the room back there, facing this way, stand, and you go over that window over there. Okay, when I tell you to, you three are going to do whatever you can do without moving or throwing something at him, yelling, whatever you got to do to get his attention to hear you. Okay? When I tell you to, you're going to start. Your job is to hear what I'm telling you. Okay? Then when I point to you, you stop. Okay? Got it? You're not supposed to say anything. You're just going to listen. All right. Ready? Voice. Thank you, Alex. Sit down. That's what's going on in our life. God is speaking to us in that still small voice. Is just say, turn around, here I am. Here's what I have for you. Listen. But it took us the noise to be gone, the people to stop talking to us to go away. Every parent's gone through this. You're trying to talk on the phone and you got a kid, mama, mom, 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 hey mom, mom, hey mom, 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 hey mom. You're like, and finally you look at the kid and what do you say? Shut up. And then you feel bad because you said shut up, because that's not a word you're supposed to use to your kid. And then you have to tell the person on the phone, hang on, I'll call you right back. And then you have to deal with the kid because he's crying and yelling and stomping around and slamming doors, right? But it isn't until he gets silent before you can go back and get back on the phone and go, okay, now what were you saying? Right? That's what God's doing. And we're being distracted. But remember, Satan wants to distract us. He doesn't want us to hear what God is saying. So when he gets silent. Now, nature's a wonderful, beautiful thing. We talked about that a couple weeks ago with the feather and the cobweb. There's some amazing nature out there. But that can be a distraction sometimes. With how can nature? We see God in the nature. Yeah, but if God is speaking to us, sometimes the nature will distract us. And Satan can use the nature as well to distract you. It's a little squirrel over, and you're like, oh, what a cute squirrel. And next thing you know, you're not listening to what God was trying to tell you. Yes, that's a squirrel moment, if y'all got that reference, right? So God sometimes just wants us to be silent before him. In the silence, we get to know the shepherd's voice. And he says, my sheep know my voice. My sheep hear me. But only if the sheep are intentionally listening. We need to create times for silence. Just as oxygen is essential for the body, silence is essential for our spiritual life. We need to come to an understanding that being silent before God is not optional, that it becomes essential in our life. We do not treat silence before God as essential. And we need to get to a place where it is. Because even though it's scheduling one more thing in my life, it's that one more thing in your life, even if it's just 2 minutes, 5 minutes of silence, will make the rest of the entire week be so much better. When you hear God's leading and you know God's comfort and you know God's in charge and he's in control and you know it and you hear it because you heard him say it, then dealing with what happens Wednesday and what happens on Friday, what happens the next week is so much easier. So schedule it. Is this something that you do often? Is this something that you want to do? Is this something that you need to do? Why not today plan, schedule, be intentional, be purposeful, being about silent before God? Now, what I want to do is do the same thing we did a while ago. Take 60 seconds of silence. And now that you know, how does it make you feel? Starting now. Now, if you noticed it, less fidgeting. It was quieter. You knew it was coming. It was planned. It was easier, and it felt like it went faster. The first time it seemed like it went on forever. But 60 seconds is not that long, but it seems like it's forever when you're not knowing what's going on. But when you take 60 seconds of just silence, it goes by so fast. So take time. Use quietness to let this message flow over you, to let it fill your hearts, to see what God is speaking to you. On the back table, we have the summary. You can go back and look at it, answer questions about it, discussion questions. Make it part of your life. And then when you make it part of your life and you have stories about what God did in the silence, share them with me. Because I think you'll see God do some amazing things in the silent times. So let this message flow over you. Let it sink deep into your heart. Let's pray.